Sometimes the deepest wounds carve the hardest hearts, and sometimes the cruelest masters are just hiding the most broken souls. On the unforgiving frontier of Blood Mesa, Ephraim Cain stood 7 feet tall and ruled his cattle empire with a fist made of iron and grief. He wasn't just a man, he was a mountain carved from loss, a walking testament to the fact that the West could take everything from you and leave you with nothing but rage for warmth. Years ago, raiders had swept through his land like a firestorm. They'd taken his cattle, burned his home, and left his wife, Sarah, in the ashes. On that day, Ephraim Cain didn't just bury his wife. He buried his heart right alongside her, covering it with so many layers of ice and stone that he forgot it was ever there. His world was dust and discipline. His kingdom was 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, defended by the gun and ruled by his will alone. Every man on his ranch knew the rules. Work hard, speak little, and never, ever cross the boss. It was a simple system. It was a cold system. And it worked. Until she arrived. Her name was Clara Ara Whitlock, and she came with the dust on her clothes and starvation in her eyes. She begged for work, for a roof over her head, for a single meal that didn't taste of desperation. Ephraim saw weakness. He saw another stray the harsh frontier was trying to chew up and spit out. His first instinct was to send her away, just like all the others. He wasn't running a charity. He was running a fortress. But something in her eyes stopped him, a flicker of fight, a storm-gray defiance that reminded him of a thunderhead building on the horizon. He didn't see a broken woman. He saw a survivor. So he made her a deal, but it wasn't a kind one. He wouldn't hire her. He would own her. She would work off a debt for his protection, a debt he would decide the value of. She became his property, not his hired help, a cog in his perfectly running, heartless machine. He expected her to break. He expected her to crumble under the weight of his cruelty and the back-breaking labor. But Clara Ara wasn't the woman he thought she was. She met his coldest stares with a quiet strength that unnerved him. She worked harder than any man on his payroll, her small hands proving just as capable with a busted water pump as with a needle and thread. Slowly, without him even realizing it, she began to do the impossible. She began to melt the frozen wasteland around his heart. But just as a flicker of warmth returned to Blood Mesa, Clara Ara's own violent past came roaring back to life, threatening to burn them both to the ground. Soon, Ephraim would have to make a choice. Would he cast her out to save his empire? Or would he fight for the woman who dared to see the man inside the monster? Before we dive into the heart of this storm, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if this story grabs you, make sure you're subscribed, because what's coming next is a tale you won't want to miss. The morning sun cast long, skeletal shadows across Blood Mesa as Ephraim Cain stepped onto the wide porch of his ranch house. His boots echoed against the weathered planks, a sound that had announced his dominion for 20 long years. At 7 feet tall, with shoulders that could block a doorway, he was a man who commanded a room without ever raising his voice. His dark hair, already streaked with silver at 35, was a map of his grief. He surveyed his kingdom, the endless acres, the herds of cattle bearing his brand, the distant mountains that fenced him in. This was his fortress, built with his own 2 hands, defended by his guns, and ruled by his will alone. The ranch house itself was as hard as the man who built it. Native stone and heavy timber, designed to withstand Apache raids and brutal winter storms. There were no decorations to soften its edges, no feminine touches to warm its corners. It was a dwelling of pure function, imposing and practical, just like Ephraim. He gripped the porch railing, his knuckles white, as his ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their eyes respectfully averted. They were good men, loyal men, handpicked for their skill and their willingness to follow orders without question. They respected him, they feared him, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Old Pete McCarty, his foreman of 15 years, trudged toward him, his grizzled face a roadmap of hard sun and harder winters. Pete was one of the few men left who remembered Ephraim from before the ice had settled in his veins, before mercy became a word he no longer used. "Morning, boss," Pete said, tipping his worn hat. "Lost 2 head to coyotes near the north pasture. Found the remains this morning." Ephraim's expression was stone. "Take Johnson and Miller. Track them down. I won't have scavengers thinking my land is easy pickings." "Yes, sir." Pete hesitated, a slight shift of his weight that Ephraim immediately noticed. Pete only hesitated when he was about to say something he knew Ephraim wouldn't like. "There's something else." Ephraim waited, his silence more intimidating than any shout. 3 families came by yesterday evening," Pete continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Droughts hit 'em hard. Their homesteads are dust. They're offering labor for food and shelter." The drought. For 6 months the sky had refused to cry. Green pastures across the territory had turned to brown dust. Lesser men were being broken by it. But Ephraim's wells ran deep, his cattle still found grass. And so, the desperate came to him, their pride swallowed, begging for the scraps from his table. "Send them away," Ephraim said, his voice as flat and cold as winter ground. "I'm not running a charity." Pete shifted his weight again, a silent protest. "One of 'em. It's just a woman on her own. Says she can cook, clean, tend animals. Looked half-starved, boss. Might be useful." Ephraim's jaw tightened. A woman. Women meant complications. They meant emotions. They meant a softness he had ruthlessly purged from his life. His ranch ran like a clock because every piece had a purpose, and there was no purpose for a stray woman. "Where is she now?" he grunted. "Camped by the creek with the others. Told him you'd give an answer this morning." Ephraim descended the porch steps, his spurs chiming a familiar authoritative rhythm against the hard-packed earth. He'd worn those same spurs for 8 years, ever since he'd stripped them from the body of a dead rustler. They were a constant reminder. What you can't defend, you don't deserve to keep. The walk to the creek gave him too much time to think, to remember. 5 years ago. It was a drought like this one that brought another desperate soul to his door. A young Apache woman named Elena, the sole survivor of a cavalry massacre. Sarah had begged him to let her stay. Sarah. Even the thought of her name was a physical weight, a pressure in his chest that never eased. His beautiful, gentle wife, who had seen goodness in everyone, who had believed love could conquer the harshness of the frontier. She had been wrong, of course. Love was a weakness. Love got you killed. The memory ambushed him. Sarah's laugh echoing through their home, her hands covered in soil, tending the small garden she'd insisted on planting. He'd told her flowers were frivolous, a waste of water. She'd just smiled and said that beauty was never a waste. She'd been wearing a blue dress that last morning, one she'd sewn herself, with tiny pearl buttons down the front. He'd kissed her goodbye, promising to be back from town before sunset. He returned to find their home a smoldering ruin. Her body was among the ashes, an Apache war party, striking without warning. They took livestock, they burned buildings, and they killed anyone who couldn't flee fast enough. Elena had survived by hiding in the root cellar. But Sarah had been in her garden, tending her precious, frivolous flowers. The blue dress was the only way he could identify her. That night, kneeling in the wreckage of his life, Ephraim Cain made a vow. Never again would he allow softness to take root in his heart. Never again would he give his enemies a target. Love was a luxury he could not afford. Mercy was a weakness that invited destruction. The creek came into view, its water running low but clear over the smooth stones. 3 families, just as Pete had said. Their wagons were dilapidated, their children thin and quiet. And sitting apart from them, her back straight despite her obvious exhaustion, was the woman. He watched her from a distance. She was young, maybe 25. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple braid, revealing the elegant line of her neck. Her dress, once a fine blue wool, was now frayed and faded, but she held herself with a quiet dignity, her chin raised as she watched the sun paint the sky. Something about her posture, That quiet defiance in the face of ruin reminded him so fiercely of Sarah that it felt like a punch to the gut. It was an echo of a warmth he'd thought long dead. She turned at the sound of his approach. He found himself looking into eyes the color of storm clouds, a fierce, intelligent gray-blue. Most people flinched from his gaze. They looked away, intimidated by his size and his reputation. This woman met his stare head-on, unflinching. "You're Kane," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am, and you're trespassing." "I'm waiting for your answer," she replied, her voice carrying the unexpected accent of education. "Your foreman said you'd decide this morning." "I have decided. I don't need kitchen help." She stood up, and even the worn dress couldn't hide a figure that was all elegant lines and surprising strength. But it was her eyes that held him, those stormy depths that seemed to see right through the walls he'd built around himself. "I can do more than kitchen work," she said. "I've handled cattle. I've broken horses. I've repaired equipment. I'm not afraid of hard labor." He let his gaze travel deliberately down her body and back up, an unspoken insult, an assertion of his power. "What I need is someone who follows orders without question, someone who understands their place. Are you that someone, Miss Whitlock?" Color rose in her cheeks, but her voice didn't waver. "I understand necessity, Mr. Kane. I understand survival. If working for you means eating regularly and sleeping under a roof, then yes, I can follow orders." He circled her slowly, the way he would a horse he was considering buying. She stood her ground, though he saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. Pride was at war with desperation in her face, and desperation was winning. "You'll work sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week," he said, his voice flat. "Sundays, you handle necessary chores only. You'll eat what the hands eat, sleep where I tell you to sleep, and speak only when spoken to." He paused, letting the next words land with the weight of a hammer. "You belong to me until your debt is paid." Her storm-cloud eyes flashed with confusion and anger. "What debt?" "The debt you incur for the privilege of surviving under my protection," he said, the words tasting like ash in his own mouth. "Room and board aren't free, Miss Whitlock. Every meal you eat, every night you spend safe from raiders and wild animals, adds to what you owe me. Work hard enough, long enough, and maybe someday you'll earn your freedom." He was being harsher than he intended, but he couldn't afford to look soft. Not in front of his men, not in front of the other families watching this brutal negotiation. He needed her to understand the rules of his world. Her eyes blazed, and for a second, he thought she would spit in his face. But she swallowed the sharp reply, her jaw tight. She needed this. She couldn't let pride be the thing that killed her. "How long?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. "As long as it takes," he replied coldly. "Could be months, could be years. Depends on how valuable you make yourself." The silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken realities of the frontier. She could accept his terms and become little more than his slave, or she could walk away and face starvation. It wasn't a choice, it was a sentence. "I accept," she said finally, the words costing her everything. A strange, unwelcome feeling twisted in Ephraim's chest. It was satisfaction, yes, but it was mixed with something else, something he refused to name. "Pete will show you to the servants' quarters," he said, turning to walk away. "You start immediately." Her voice stopped him cold. "Mr. Kane?" He glanced back over his shoulder, his face a mask of stone. "What happened to your last kitchen help?" The lie came easily, a well-practiced defense. "She got ideas above her station. I don't tolerate that kind of trouble twice." There had been no previous kitchen help. No woman had set foot in his house for 5 years. But Clara Whitlock didn't need to know that. She needed to understand that his mercy had run out long ago. She needed to be grateful, obedient, and terrified. As he walked back toward the ranch house, he could feel Pete's disapproving stare burning into his back. Pete had known Sarah. Pete thought this was cruel. Pete was wrong. Cruelty would have been leaving her to starve by the creek. This was survival, hers and his. She would work, earn her keep, and one day she would leave. She would be a ghost, passing through his fortress without leaving a mark. But as he climbed the steps to his cold, empty house, Ephraim couldn't shake the image of those storm-gray eyes that had looked at him without a trace of fear. Most people saw a monster, a giant who'd built his empire on the graves of his enemies. Clara Ara Whitlock had looked at him and seen something else entirely. He didn't know what it was, and that, more than anything, terrified him. Hidden beneath his shirt, on a thin gold chain, Sarah's wedding ring rested against his skin. It was his shield, his talisman against the temptation to ever feel again. He touched it through the rough cotton of his shirt and renewed his silent vow. This woman would not breach his defenses. She would work, she would serve her purpose, and she would leave his heart exactly as she found it, untouched, frozen, dead. Some promises, he was about to learn, are impossible to keep. Clara Ara's first week at the Kane Ranch was a blur of fire and ice. The fire was the back-breaking labor that started before dawn and ended long after sunset. The ice was the cold, unyielding presence of Ephraim Kane. He watched her from a distance, his silence a constant judgment. His orders were delivered through Pete or the other hands, clipped and impersonal. Boss wants the harness leather oiled before noon. Kane says the chicken coop needs mucking out. Mr. Ephraim's expecting his shirts mended by evening. She obeyed every command without a word of complaint. She hauled water until her shoulders screamed. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw. She cooked for 23 hungry men, turning meager supplies into meals that earned her grudging nods of respect. She was proving her worth, one exhausting chore at a time. But she felt his eyes on her constantly. He was a storm cloud on the horizon of her world, dark, imposing, and always there. She learned to read the subtle shifts in the atmosphere of the ranch that signaled his mood. She was neither servant nor guest, a ghost in a limbo of his own making, and it kept everyone, including her, on edge. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday. The sun beat down on Blood Mesa like a blacksmith's hammer, the temperature soaring past 100 degrees. Clara Ara had been hauling water to the horse troughs since sunrise. Her vision was starting to blur, the dusty yard swimming before her eyes. Each bucket felt heavier than the last. She'd made maybe 50 trips when her legs finally gave out. The wooden bucket slipped from her grasp, and the world went black. She crumpled to the ground, the sound of water splashing onto the thirsty earth, the last thing she heard. When she woke, she was in the cool shade of the barn. A weathered face was peering down at her. It was Doc Morrison, the territory's physician for the last 30 years. His presence meant someone had been worried enough to send for him. "Easy there, young lady," the doctor said, pressing a cool, damp cloth to her forehead. "Heat got the better of you. Nothing a little rest, and some water won't cure." Panic shot through her. "I have to work," she rasped, trying to sit up. Mr. Kane expects his people to be useful, not dead," a gruff voice interrupted. It was Pete, standing in the barn doorway. Through the opening, Clara Ara could see Ephraim. He was arguing with his foreman, his posture rigid, his hands clenched into fists. Pete was gesturing toward the barn, his expression worried. Ephraim just stood there, immovable as a granite cliff. "He's angry," Clara Ara whispered. Doc Morrison chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Ephraim Kane's been angry for 5 years straight. The question is whether he's angry at you or at himself for caring that you collapsed." Before she could process that, Ephraim's massive frame filled the doorway, his shadow falling over her like a sentence. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in the sweat-stained dress, the tangled hair, the exhaustion that was plain on her face. "Can she work?" he asked the doctor, his voice flat. "Not today," Doc Morrison replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Not unless you want a corpse on your conscience, Ephraim. The girl's been driving herself into the ground." Ephraim's face flickered. It was the first time Clara had ever seen him look surprised. He wasn't used to being challenged. "She'll rest today," he said finally, his voice tight. "Tomorrow, she returns to her duties." "Tomorrow, she works reasonable hours," Doc Morrison countered, standing his ground. "Or I'll be back to treat her for something a whole lot worse than heat exhaustion." The two men locked gazes, a silent battle of wills. Ephraim, the undisputed king of Blood Mesa, and the old doctor who feared nothing, not even him. Finally, Ephraim gave a curt nod and turned to leave. He paused at the barn entrance without looking back. "Pete will bring you food," he grunted. "Stay out of the sun." The words were gruff, an order, not an offer of kindness. But underneath the harsh tone, Clara heard something else. It might have been pragmatism. A dead worker was a bad investment. But it might have been something more. A flicker of concern he couldn't quite hide. And for the first time, Clara wondered if the doctor was right. She had seen him as a monster. But what if the monster was just a cage? That evening, as the blistering heat finally began to fade, Clara felt strong enough to walk. She found herself drawn to the horse corral. One of the horses, a handsome bay, stood apart from the others, favoring a leg that had been gashed on a sharp rock a few days prior. The hands had tried to treat it, but the animal was skittish and in pain, lashing out at anyone who came near. Moving slowly, she approached the fence, humming a soft, wordless tune. It was a lullaby her mother used to sing, a melody from a life that felt 1,000 years away. "Easy there, beautiful," she murmured, letting the horse catch her scent. "I know it hurts. I know you're scared, but sometimes you have to let someone help." The horse snorted, but didn't back away. She slipped between the fence rails, her movements calm and deliberate. The soft melody seemed to soothe him. When she reached his side, he stood still, allowing her to examine the wound. It was infected. The bandage was dirty. It needed proper care. "You need better medicine than this," she whispered, stroking his neck. "And someone who knows what they're doing." "Do you?" The voice came from directly behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Ephraim. He was standing so close she hadn't heard him approach. In the fading twilight, the harsh lines of his face seemed softer. "I've treated animals before," she said, her voice careful. "My father raised cattle." He stepped closer, his presence making the horse tense again. "Johnson tried to doctor him yesterday, nearly got his head kicked in." "He's in pain," she said, her eyes meeting Ephraim's. "Pain makes any creature defensive." The words hung in the air between them, suddenly meaning more than just the horse. She felt as though they were talking about him. "Fix him," Ephraim said. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite an order either. It was something else. A test. She nodded and set to work. Pete brought her clean water and supplies from the house. As she gently cleaned the wound, she kept humming, her voice a low, steady comfort. The horse, which had fought off 3 grown men, stood perfectly still under her gentle touch. Ephraim watched from the other side of the fence, his silence a heavy weight. She could feel his eyes on her, and for the first time, it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like curiosity. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice low. "My father," she said, not looking up from her work. "He used to say animals were better patients than people. They don't argue with the treatment." "Your father was a rancher?" "A small operation. Nothing like this," she said, gesturing to the vast darkness that was his empire. "But he loved his animals. He said treating them right was the mark of a good man." Ephraim's face darkened. "Good men don't last long out here." "Maybe they do," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Maybe they just look different than you expect." She instantly regretted it. Challenging him was dangerous, but when she glanced up, she didn't see anger in his face. She saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. Surprise? Or maybe recognition. He recovered quickly, his mask of cold control slamming back into place. "Get back to the house. You've done enough for one day. She finished bandaging the leg and gathered her things. As she turned to leave, the horse nuzzled her shoulder, a simple gesture of trust that brought a sudden sharp sting to her eyes. It had been so long since anything had shown her kindness. Clara Ara. She froze. He had never said her name before, not since that first cruel morning. He stood silhouetted against the last light of sunset, a giant figure of shadow and power. The horse. What would you call him? She didn't have to think. The word came straight from a place deep inside her that she thought had long since withered and died. Hope, she said. I'd call him Hope. Ephraim nodded slowly, his gaze unreadable. Hope it is. Later that night, lying on her narrow cot, Clara Ara couldn't stop replaying the scene in her mind. A crack had appeared in Ephraim Kane's armor, a tiny glimpse of the man he might have been before the world had broken him. For a few minutes he had treated her like a person, not a piece of property. It was a dangerous thought. Hope, she knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. But as she drifted to sleep, she couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, watching her with something that looked almost like respect. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to the monster of Blood Mesa than anyone knew. And in the darkness, miles away, in the charred ruins of Ephraim's old homestead, the moonlight glinted off the tip of a blood-stained Apache arrow, half buried in the dirt. A secret waiting to be unearthed. A secret that would connect Ephraim's tragic past to Clara Ara's in a way neither of them could ever imagine. The truth was coming, and it would be more terrible than the ghosts that already haunted them. The melody followed Ephraim into his dreams. He woke before dawn, the haunting tune still echoing in his mind, the wordless lullaby Clara Ara had hummed to the injured horse. But it wasn't just a tune. It was a ghost. It was Sarah's song. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. Sarah, humming that exact melody as she tended her garden, her voice a soft counterpoint to the buzzing of the bees. He sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, fighting a wave of grief so powerful it threatened to pull him under. 5 years, and the sound of a song could still shatter him. He dressed quickly and stepped out onto the porch. A single light burned in the kitchen window. Clara Ara was already at work. The woman was a machine. In just a few weeks, she had transformed his ranch. The broken water pump now worked flawlessly. The chaotic supply room was organized with military precision. She had even coaxed the temperamental old stove into behaving. More than that, she had earned the respect of his men. They were hard men, suspicious of outsiders and downright dismissive of most women. But they tipped their hats to Clara Ara. They spoke to her with a courtesy that baffled Ephraim. She was becoming indispensable, and that made her dangerous. He tried to lose himself in work, but her presence was everywhere. He saw her mending harnesses with quick, competent fingers. He overheard her giving a young hand a quiet word of encouragement. He saw her pause to scratch the ears of one of the ranch dogs. Small acts of kindness. Sarah's kindness. The comparison was a splinter in his mind, digging deeper every time he tried to ignore it. Pete found him on the porch, staring at nothing. "You're gonna wear a groove in that wood, boss." Ephraim grunted, not turning. "Cattle count?" "All accounted for," Pete said. He hesitated, then plowed ahead with his usual bluntness. "That girl. She's been asking questions. About the ranch. How long you been here? What happened to the old place?" Ephraim's jaw tightened. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you built this place from the ground up with nothing but grit." She seemed impressed. The compliment irritated him. He didn't need her approval. "She's getting ideas above her station." Pete's eyebrows shot up. "Ideas like what? Like maybe she's more than just hired help?" He took a deep breath. "Maybe she is, Ephraim. Maybe she's what this place has been missing for 5 long years." The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to the cold, empty world Ephraim had built. "This conversation is over," Ephraim said, his voice deadly quiet. "Ephraim," Pete said, his own voice softening. "I knew you before. I knew you when Sarah was alive. That man was happier, and he was a hell of a lot better company. Pete tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Ephraim alone with the truth. That evening, he found himself drawn to the corral again. The horse, Hope, was healing well, the wound clean and the swelling gone. Clara Ara was there, giving the horse his evening feed. She'd changed into a simple white blouse and a dark skirt. Her auburn hair had escaped its braid, framing her face in soft waves in the golden light of sunset. And for a split second, the world stopped. She looked so much like Sarah, standing there in the fading light, that his breath caught in his throat. The same gentle grace, the same quiet competence. But where Sarah had been soft, Clara Ara was forged steel. She was a survivor, her strength honed by a hardship he was only beginning to guess at. "Hope's doing well," she said, her voice pulling him back from the past. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "My father bred horses," she said, stroking Hope's neck. "Nothing as fine as yours, but good sturdy stock. This one reminds me of a mare we had. Same intelligence in her eyes." The question left his lips before he could stop it. "What happened to your father's farm?" Her expression clouded over. "Drought took the cattle, then raiders took the horses. Papa, he died that winter. From grief, I think, as much as fever." "And you?" "I survived," she said simply. "That's what Papa taught me. Survive no matter what. Keep moving forward. Never give up hope that things can get better." The words resonated deep in his soul. They were two sides of the same coin. Both had lost everything. Both had been forced to rebuild from ashes. "Your father sounds like a wise man," he said, his voice rough. A sad smile touched her lips. "He was. He used to say that our true character is revealed in how we treat the helpless. Animals, children, those who can't defend themselves. He said kindness was a different kind of strength." The unspoken criticism was clear. She was talking about him, about his harshness, his coldness, but she did it so gently, he couldn't take offense. "Kindness is a luxury out here," he said, the words defensive. "Is it?" she asked softly. "Or is it a necessity?" Before he could answer, she turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The woman was a master at planting questions in his mind that undermined the very foundations of his world. Later that night, sitting in his study, he saw the light in her window. She was still awake. What was she thinking? What secrets did she hold? The curiosity was a dangerous fire, one he knew he should extinguish. Then he heard it. Faintly, drifting on the night air, the humming, Sarah's song. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't fight the grief. He let the melody wash over him, a ghost from a life he thought was gone forever. It was a moment of weakness, a crack in the ice, and through that crack, a single dangerous thought took root. What if Pete was right? What if she wasn't the danger? What if she was the cure? In her small, dark room, Clara Ara traced the edge of a letter hidden beneath her mattress. The paper was worn soft, the ink faded, but the words were burned into her memory. They were a threat. They were a promise. They were from the man she had killed. "My dearest wife," it began, "you cannot hide from me forever. Every mile you run only delays the inevitable. When I find you, and I will find you, your punishment will be measured in years, not days." She forced herself to stop reading. The letter was from Judge Marcus Blackwood, her husband, a man the world saw as a pillar of the community, but who, behind closed doors, was a monster of exquisite cruelty. And in his death, his words still had the power to make her hands tremble. She had killed him. In self-defense, yes, but she had killed him. And she had been running ever since. For the first time in 3 years, she had started to feel safe here at Blood Mesa. Ephraim Kane was hard, yes, but he wasn't cruel like Marcus. There was an honor to his coldness, a logic to his rules. And lately, when he looked at her, she saw something other than a piece of property. She saw a person. This feeling of safety terrified her more than anything. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was a weakness that had almost gotten her killed once before. But as she hid the letter, another thought, even more terrifying, surfaced. What if the real danger wasn't the past chasing her, but the future she was starting to want? A future with a man who was just as broken as she was. A future on Blood Mesa. She didn't know that the very ground she stood on held a secret that tied her fate to Ephraim's, in a knot of blood and fire. The man she was running from and the man she was running to were connected by a tragedy neither of them could possibly imagine. And the proof was waiting, buried in the dark. The next morning, the fragile peace of Blood Mesa was shattered. The change in atmosphere was subtle at first. Conversations that stopped when she approached, eyes that darted away. The easy camaraderie she'd built with the hands was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful distance. It was Tommy Rodriguez, one of the younger hands, who gave her the news. "Miss Clara Ara," he said, his face pale. "The boss wants to see you, in his study. He said it's important." A cold dread washed over her. An important meeting with a powerful man had never in her experience ended well. Did he say what it was about? "No, ma'am," Tommy mumbled. "But there was a rider last night, after you'd gone to bed, looked like a lawman. The boss has been looking like a thundercloud ever since." A lawman. Her carefully constructed world began to crumble. She walked to the main house on legs that felt like lead. She knocked on the study door. "Come in." His voice was cold, colder than she had ever heard it. She stepped inside. He was standing with his back to her, staring out the window. His whole body was rigid with a tension that vibrated in the air. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Kane?" "Sit down." She sat, her hands clenched in her lap. He turned to face her, and the look on his face stopped her breath. This wasn't the man who had shown her a flicker of kindness. This was the monster she had first met. This was the man who had built his empire on violence and intimidation. "Deputy Marshal Hayes paid me a visit last night," Ephraim said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "He had some interesting questions. About you." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest you haven't been entirely honest with me." He moved to his desk and picked up a piece of paper, a wanted poster. He held it like it was a venomous snake. "Care to explain this, Mrs. Blackwood?" The name was a physical blow, a name she had shed 3 years ago. To hear it from his lips felt like being stripped naked in a blizzard. "I go by Whitlock now," she said, her voice a thread. "I don't care what name you use," he snarled, the controlled fury finally breaking through. "I care that you lied to me. I care that harboring a fugitive could cost me everything I've built." She stood slowly, meeting his rage with a quiet dignity she didn't feel. "What exactly did the deputy tell you?" "That you're wanted for the murder of your husband, Judge Marcus Blackwood, that there's a substantial reward for your capture." His dark eyes bored into her. "Is any of that untrue?" This was it, the moment of truth. She could lie, she could try to spin a story, but she was tired of running. She was tired of lying. "I killed him," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But it wasn't murder. It was self-defense." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at her blunt confession. Self-defense? "The man the world knew as Judge Blackwood was not the man I lived with," she said, the words pouring out of her now. "He was a monster. He enjoyed inflicting pain. The night he died, he would have killed me. I had to choose. His life or mine. You could have gone to the law." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "He was the law. His father is a federal judge. His brothers are in the territorial government. Who would have believed me? A farmer's daughter against a powerful, respected family." The truth of her words hung in the air, undeniable. He studied her face, searching for a lie, for any sign of deceit. He moved back to the window. The silence stretched, each second an eternity. She waited for the verdict, for him to cast her out. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The rage was gone, replaced by a grim calculation. Hayes is coming back. Tomorrow morning. He expects me to turn you over. The floor dropped out from under her. I understand. I'll be gone before he arrives. Like hell you will. The ferocity in his voice stunned her. He turned from the window, and his eyes were blazing, not with anger at her, but with a protective fire that took her breath away. You belong to me, he said, the words a low growl. Remember? That was our arrangement, and no jumped-up deputy gets to take my property. He took a step toward her. You are not leaving this ranch. Hope, treacherous and bright, flared in her chest. But you'd risk trouble with the law? For me? I'm risking trouble for what's right, he corrected. His expression softened, just for a second. I've seen what you are, Clara Ara. I've seen your kindness. I've seen your courage, and I understand what it means to lose everything and have to rebuild. I'm not going to let them take you. Tears she had refused to shed for 3 years burned behind her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, he said, his voice hardening again. From now on, no more lies. I need to know everything. If I'm going to protect you, I need to know exactly what kind of snake we're fighting. She nodded, understanding that her survival now depended entirely on this man, on trusting him with the whole ugly truth. There's more, she said, her voice barely audible. There are documents, papers I took when I fled, evidence of my husband's crimes, bribery, extortion, things that would destroy his family's precious reputation. Ephraim's eyes narrowed. This changed things. This gave them a weapon. Where are these documents? Hidden, she said, in a place no one would ever think to look. She took a deep breath. But there's one more thing, a letter. A letter my husband wrote the day before he died. It wasn't to me. Who was it to? Ephraim asked, leaning forward. Clara looked him straight in the eye, her own stormy gaze filled with a dawning horror as a new, terrible suspicion began to form in her own mind. It was to the leader of an Apache war party, she said. He was paying them for a raid. Ephraim froze, the blood draining from his face. What raid? It was 5 years ago, she whispered, her heart pounding as she connected the dots. Near here, a rancher's homestead was burned to the ground. The man's wife was killed. The room spun. The air turned to ice. Ephraim stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated agony. The raid that had destroyed his life. The raid that had taken Sarah. It hadn't been random. It had been a contract killing, ordered and paid for by the very man whose widow he was now protecting. His grief, his anger, his entire world for the last 5 years had been built on a lie. And the woman standing before him held the proof. The snake they were fighting wasn't just chasing her. It had been coiled in his own heart all along, and its name was Blackwood. Justice wasn't what he wanted anymore. He wanted revenge, and he would burn the world to the ground to get it. Ephraim's father's colt. 45 felt like a familiar weight on his hip, a piece of his own history. 3 generations of Cain men had carried it. It was a tool of frontier justice, a final arbiter in a land where the law was often just a suggestion. Now, as he watched Deputy Hayes and his 2 hired guns ride up to the house, he felt the cold certainty that the gun would speak before the day was over. Hayes was a weasel of a man, with the resentful eyes of someone who hated anyone bigger or more successful than himself. Ephraim had seen his type 100 times. "Mr. Kane," Hayes called out, dismounting. "I trust you've had time to consider our conversation." "I have," Ephraim said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't move from the porch using his height and position as an advantage. "And I've decided you're mistaken." Hayes's face darkened. "There's no mistake. Clara Blackwood is a wanted fugitive. The law says you have to surrender her." "The woman in my house is Clara Whitlock," Ephraim corrected, his voice dropping another degree. A valued employee. Any resemblance to your fugitive is a coincidence you're going to have to live with. The deputy's hand drifted toward his gun. Around the ranch yard, shadows shifted. Pete McGarty appeared near the barn, a Winchester cradled casually in his arms. Tommy Rodriguez and 3 other hands materialized behind water troughs and wagons. They were silent, but their message was loud and clear. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Kane," Hayes blustered, his confidence wavering. "I've got a federal warrant." Ephraim smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "A warrant signed by whom? Judge Cornelius Blackwood? The father of the man my employee claims was a corrupt criminal? That's not a warrant, deputy. That's a vendetta." He descended the steps slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. He towered over the deputy, a mountain of quiet rage. "You came onto my land. You threatened my household. You're waving a piece of paper that's likely drenched in corruption. I think you're the one who needs to reconsider his position." He let the silence hang in the air. "Now," Ephraim continued, his tone turning almost friendly, "I understand you're just a man doing a job, and sometimes jobs are unpleasant. Sometimes they're even mistaken." He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold. He tossed it into the dust at the deputy's feet. "There's $500 in there," Ephraim said, "for the trouble of your long ride, and for the honest mistake you're about to report to your superiors. You came here, you found no one matching the description, and you left. End of story." The 2 hired guns stared at the pouch with hungry eyes. Their loyalty was for sale, and Ephraim had just met the price. Hayes swallowed hard, greed warring with his duty. Greed won. "I suppose mistakes can happen," he mumbled, scooping up the pouch. "Clara Whitlock is a common enough name." "A reasonable conclusion," Ephraim agreed. Hayes stuffed the gold into his saddlebags. "Of course," he said, a sly look in his eyes. "There's a $2,000 reward on her head. This barely covers my expenses." Ephraim's smile vanished. "Deputy," he said, his voice turning to ice, "my offer was for you to leave. My next offer will involve you being buried. You have 10 seconds to get on your horse and ride out of my sight. If I see your face on my land again, I will not be offering you gold." The threat was absolute. Hayes's face went pale. He scrambled onto his horse, his 2 men already wheeling their mounts around. They galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of corruption behind them. Clara Ara stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but composed. "Is it over?" "For now," Ephraim said, his hand never leaving his gun. "But that was just the foot soldier. The general is still out there, and now he knows where you are." He turned to face her, the revelation from the night before still burning between them. "The letter. The one from your husband to the raiders. Do you have it?" She nodded. "It's with the other documents. Show me." She led him to her small room. From a loose floorboard beneath her cot, she pulled out a leather satchel. Inside were dozens of papers, legal documents, ledgers, and a single folded letter. She handed it to him. He unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant, educated. The words were cold, precise. It was a contract for the destruction of a homestead and the elimination of its occupants. His homestead. And the price for Sarah's life had been $200 and a dozen head of cattle. He read the signature at the bottom. Marcus Blackwood. The world tilted. The air in the small room grew thin. For 5 years, he had mourned Sarah, his grief a pure, clean thing. He had hated the Apaches, a faceless enemy. But it was all a lie. Sarah hadn't been the victim of a random raid. She had been murdered, assassinated, by the man whose crimes had brought Clara Ara to his door. Their pasts weren't just similar. They were the same story, written by the same villain. "Why?" he whispered, his voice raw with a pain so deep he thought it would split him in 2. Why would he do this? Clara Ara looked at the letter, then at the other documents. Her eyes widened as she picked up a ledger. I don't know, she stammered. But this is a ledger of his business dealings. Bribes, land grabs. He was trying to acquire land all over this territory, using intimidation, false claims. She scanned the pages, her finger tracing a line. There's a note here, about a piece of land with deep wells, impervious to drought. A rancher who refused to sell. Ephraim's ranch. The one he had inherited from his father. The one Sarah had loved. Marcus Blackwood hadn't just wanted the land. He had wanted to destroy the man who wouldn't sell. He had taken Ephraim's wife to break his spirit. He didn't just kill her, Ephraim said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. He used her death to try and drive me off my land. He thought I'd break. He thought I'd run. Instead, you built a fortress, Clara said softly. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. She wasn't just a woman he was protecting. She was the key. She was the weapon. She was Providence, delivered to his door. She was the living, breathing proof of Marcus Blackwood's evil. And she was the one person in the world who could understand the rage that was now consuming him. He sent you here, Ephraim said, the words a revelation. His evil sent you to me. He thought he was destroying me, but he just delivered the sword I'm going to use to gut his entire family. Clara saw the look in his eyes and shivered. The cold, controlled rancher was gone. In his place was an avenging angel, forged in the fires of a grief that had just been given a name and a face. But she was wrong about one thing. Deputy Hayes wasn't riding back to his superiors with a report of a dead end. He was riding to the nearest telegraph office. He had taken Ephraim's gold, but the $2,000 reward from a powerful federal judge was a much better bet. He was about to sell them out. And Judge Cornelius Blackwood was not a man who sent deputies. He was a man who brought armies. The real storm was coming, and it would wash over Blood Mesa in a tide of blood and bullets. The fragile peace bought with gold lasted less than 24 hours. The rider was spotted at dawn, a lone figure on the horizon. But behind him, the sun glinted off something else. A dozen more riders, then 20. An army cresting the ridge, their dust cloud a promise of war. At their head rode a man in the black robes of a judge, his silver hair blowing in the wind. Judge Cornelius Blackwood. He sat his horse like a king, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. Beside him rode a man with the silver badge of a U.S. Marshal. And trailing just behind them, looking pale and terrified, was Deputy Hayes. The weasel had taken the bribe and then betrayed them. Ephraim stood at the ranch gate, Clara at his side. This time, his men weren't hiding in the shadows. They stood in a line behind him, rifles held ready. They were outnumbered, but they stood on their own ground, ready to defend their home. That's close enough, Blackwood, Ephraim called out, his voice booming across the dry land. The judge raised a hand, halting his posse. His pale, icy eyes fixed on Clara, filled with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical force. Clara Blackwood, the judge intoned, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence. Your running is over. It's Mrs. Kane, Clara corrected, her voice clear and strong. She held up her hand, the simple gold band of Sarah's ring catching the morning light. I married Mr. Kane last night. I am his wife. The judge's expression tightened. A strategic marriage, a legal shield. He was a man of the law. He understood its power. A fraudulent union designed to obstruct justice. It will be annulled. There's nothing fraudulent about it, Ephraim said, stepping forward. She is my wife, and she is under my protection. He locked eyes with the judge. And I know what your son did. I know about the raid. I know he had my first wife murdered. The accusation hit the clearing like a thunderclap. The federal marshals shifted uneasily. This wasn't a simple case of a fugitive wife anymore. This was something far darker. Judge Blackwood's composure finally broke. Lies, he roared. The desperate lies of a cornered killer. My son was a great man, destroyed by this black-hearted viper. Your son was a monster who left a trail of evidence a blind man could follow. Ephraim shot back. He held up the letter. I have the proof, Judge. A contract for murder in your son's own hand. That's a forgery. Then let an impartial court decide, Clara Ara cried out. Not your court, Judge. Not your hand-picked jury. A real court, where the truth can be heard. The judge's face was purple with rage. He had come here for a swift, brutal conclusion, not a legal debate. He had come to see the woman who killed his son hang. You will have your trial, he snarled, in my courtroom, and I will be the one to sign your death warrant. He turned to the U.S. Marshal. Carson, arrest her. Arrest them both. Kane is charged with harboring a fugitive and obstruction of justice. The marshal, a hard-faced man named Carson, looked from the judge to Ephraim, then to the line of determined ranch hands. He could see this was no simple arrest. This was going to be a bloodbath. Judge, he began, perhaps we should— You will follow my orders, Marshal, Blackwood screamed, or you will be charged with dereliction of duty. Arrest them now. Marshal Carson sighed. He was a lawman. His orders were to follow the judge. He drew his pistol. Mr. Kane, don't make this any harder. Surrender the woman. She's not going anywhere, Ephraim said, his hand dropping to his Colt. Last chance, Carson yelled. The world seemed to slow down. Clara Ara saw the judge raise his own ornate pistol, his eyes blazing with madness. He wasn't aiming at Ephraim. He was aiming at her. No! Ephraim bellowed, moving to shield her with his own body. The judge's gun barked. Clara Ara screamed as Ephraim grunted, stumbling back a step. She saw the hole in his shirt, right over his heart. But he didn't fall. He just stood there, a look of grim shock on his face. The world exploded. Pete's Winchester cracked, and one of the judge's men tumbled from his saddle. Tommy Rodriguez fired from the barn loft, and another man screamed. The air filled with the roar of gunfire, the whistle of bullets, and the panicked shouts of men. Ephraim drew his Colt, his movements smooth and deadly, despite the impact he'd just taken. He fired once. Judge Blackwood cried out, clutching a bloody arm, his ornate pistol clattering to the ground. Take cover! Ephraim roared, shoving Clara Ara behind the heavy stone gatepost. Bullets splintered the wood around them. The ranch yard had become a killing field. But Ephraim's men had the advantage. They knew the land. They were fighting for their home, for their family. The federal posse, following the orders of a man clearly driven by vengeance, found themselves pinned down, their attack stalling. Fall back! Marshal Carson yelled, realizing the situation was hopeless. Regroup at the ridge! But Judge Blackwood was beyond reason. Cowards! He shrieked, his face contorted with hate. He saw Clara peeking from behind the gatepost. He broke cover, scrambling for his fallen pistol, intent on finishing the job himself. Ephraim raised his Colt to fire again, but another marshal shot him from the side. The bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered, his face white with pain. Clara Ara saw it all happen in a flash. Ephraim wounded. The judge, fueled by madness, charging toward them. There was no time to think. Instinct took over. Pete had left a loaded rifle leaning against the gate. She snatched it up, the stock feeling heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. She raised it, sighted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. 20 feet away, Judge Blackwood was lifted off his feet, a red stain blossoming on the front of his black robes. He landed in the dust with a heavy thud, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. A stunned silence fell over the battlefield. The fight was over. Don't move! Pete yelled, his rifle trained on Marshal Carson, who had started to move toward the judge's body. Clara Ara dropped the rifle and scrambled to Ephraim's side. You're hit! She cried, her hands fluttering over the hole in his shirt. It's nothing, he gasped, but his face was pale. She ripped open his shirt. And then she saw it. A deep dent in the metal of the old lucky horseshoe he wore on a chain around his neck. The judge's bullet was flattened against it. It had saved his life. His shoulder wound was bleeding freely, but it wasn't fatal. Just a scratch, he said, a grim smile touching his lips as he looked at the dead judge. Looks like my luck held. Marshal Carson slowly holstered his weapon. He looked at his dead and wounded men. He looked at the unyielding faces of the ranch hands. He looked at the woman who had just killed a federal judge. And he knew this was a disaster. "This isn't over," he said, his voice heavy. "There will be investigations." "Good," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm as she pressed a makeshift bandage against Ephraim's shoulder. "Let them investigate. Let them see all the evidence. The truth is on our side." As the surviving marshals collected their dead and wounded and retreated from Blood Mesa, a new era began. The battle was over, but the war for their future was just beginning. They had won, but the cost was written in blood in the dust of their front gate. Ephraim looked at Clara, this woman who had saved his life, who had faced down an army for him. The ice around his heart hadn't just melted, it had been shattered. In its place was a love so fierce and protective it scared him. He had started this by claiming her as his property. Now he knew the truth. He had never owned her. From the moment she arrived, she had owned him, and he would spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy of that. The darkness of the Blackwood family had been extinguished, but its shadow was long, and in the silence after the storm, they both knew that true peace was still a long way off. The 6 months that followed the shootout at Blood Mesa were a whirlwind of investigations, testimonies, and telegrams. The death of a federal judge, even a corrupt one, sent shockwaves all the way to Washington. But as the dust settled, the truth, stubborn and undeniable, began to emerge. Marshal Carson, a man of integrity despite his role in the siege, presented an honest report. He included Ephraim's letter from Marcus Blackwood, the one contracting the murder of his first wife. He included Clara's detailed ledgers, which exposed a vast network of corruption, bribery, and land grabbing that implicated dozens of officials across 3 territories. The Blackwood Empire crumbled. Clara Kane, once a wanted fugitive, was hailed as a hero, a woman who had not only defended herself but had single-handedly brought down a corrupt dynasty. The territorial government, deeply embarrassed, formally cleared her of all charges and issued a public apology. But peace was more than just a legal document. It was something they had to build, day by day, on the blood-soaked ground of their past. The first thing they did was change the sign. Pete McCarty, with a wide grin, supervised as the new one was hoisted into place. It no longer read Kane Ranch. It read Kane and Clara Ranch. "It reflects reality," Ephraim said, his arm wrapped firmly around his wife's waist, as they stood on the porch of their home. The house itself had been rebuilt, expanded. The dark, imposing fortress was now a warm, welcoming home, often filled with the noise of people who had nowhere else to go. The ranch had become a sanctuary, a place for second chances. They hired men with troubled pasts, giving them a chance to earn an honest wage. They took in families broken by the frontier, offering them shelter and a new start. The empire of ice had become an empire of hope. Ephraim himself was a changed man. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened. He still commanded respect, but it was no longer born of fear. It was born of admiration. He listened to his men. He laughed. He deferred to his wife's judgment on everything from horse breeding to the best way to handle a dispute between hands. He had learned that true strength wasn't in ruling alone, but in building together. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Clara turned to him, a mysterious smile playing on her lips. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her storm-gray eyes glowing with a light he'd never seen before. She took his large, calloused hand and placed it on her still, flat stomach. "Doc Morrison confirmed it yesterday," she whispered. "We're going to have a baby." The world stopped. For a terrifying second, the old fear gripped him, the fear of loss, the memory of the ashes, of the little blue dress. He had lost one family. The thought of risking that pain again was a physical blow. But then he looked into Clara's eyes, and he saw not fear, but a boundless, unwavering love. He saw the strength that had carried her through hell and back. He saw their future. The fear dissolved, replaced by a wave of joy so powerful it brought him to his knees. He knelt before her, pressing his ear to her stomach, as if he could hear the tiny heartbeat that was a promise of new life. Tears, hot and cleansing, streamed down his face. The tears he hadn't shed for Sarah, the tears he hadn't allowed himself for 5 long years. "Happy?" she asked softly, her fingers tracing the silver streaks in his hair. "Happy doesn't cover it," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "Terrified, grateful, amazed." He looked up at her, his heart overflowing. "You saved me, Clara Ara. You walked into my hell and led me back into the light." "We saved each other," she said, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. They stood on the porch for a long time, watching the stars appear in the velvet sky. The war was over. The ghosts had been laid to rest. The deep wounds had finally healed, leaving behind scars that were not a reminder of pain, but of survival. A reminder that love, true and tenacious, could grow in the hardest of soils. "If it's a boy," Ephraim said, his voice quiet but sure, "we'll name him Samuel. It means heard by God. Because I think my prayers were finally answered." "Samuel Cain," Clara Ara tested the name. "I like it." She smiled. "And if it's a girl?" Ephraim didn't hesitate. "Hope," he said, "because that's what you brought me. That's what you are." On the vast, unforgiving frontier of Blood Mesa, a place that had known so much grief and violence, a new story was being written. It wasn't a story of revenge or survival anymore. It was a story of redemption, a story of love, a story that proved that even the hardest hearts could be broken open to let the light in. The dynasty of Cain would continue, not as an empire of one, but as a legacy for 2, and for the new life that was just beginning. If this story of redemption and love on the harsh frontier touched your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You never know what tales of darkness and light are waiting to be told right here in the heart of the storm.